The morning sun crept over the dusty horizon of Dust Valley, painting the weathered buildings in shades of amber and gold. It was supposed to be the finest day in Marianne Miller's 22 years of life, her wedding day. The small frontier town had been buzzing with anticipation for weeks, as this union between the Miller family and the wealthy Hargroves would be the social event of the season. Marianne stood before the cracked mirror in her childhood bedroom, her trembling fingers adjusting the ivory lace collar of her mother's wedding dress. The garment had yellowed slightly with age, but it still held the grace and dignity of better times. Her mother had worn it 30 years ago when she'd married Pa in a small ceremony back in Missouri, before they'd made the treacherous journey west seeking fortune and a new life. "You look beautiful, dear," whispered her mother, Elizabeth Miller, as she entered the room carrying a cup of chamomile tea. Her weathered hands, marked by years of hard labor on their modest farm, gently smoothed a wayward strand of Marianne's chestnut hair. Marianne forced a smile, though her reflection betrayed the unease churning in her stomach. "Thank you, Ma." Elizabeth's eyes, once bright with hope, now carried shadows of worry. She set the tea on the dresser and clasped her daughter's hands. "Marriage it's not always easy, Marianne, but you're strong, stronger than you know." The words hung heavy in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. Marianne noticed how her mother's gaze lingered on the high collar of the dress, how her lips pressed together as if holding back words that desperately wanted to escape. Outside, the sounds of preparation filled the morning air. Wagon wheels creaked as families from neighboring ranches arrived for the ceremony. Children's laughter mingled with the neighing of horses and the casual chatter of townsfolk gathering near the small wooden chapel at the end of Main Street. Through her window, Marianne could see the chapel being decorated with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, prairie roses, and stalks of golden wheat tied with ribbons. Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, directed the efforts with military precision, ensuring every detail was perfect for what she'd been calling the wedding of the decade. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her father, Samuel Miller, entered with heavy steps. He was a man of few words, his face carved by wind and sun into a permanent expression of stoic endurance. In his calloused hands, he carried a small wooden box. "This was your grandmother's," he said gruffly, opening it to reveal a delicate gold cross on a thin chain. "Thought you should wear it today." As he fastened it around her neck, Marianne caught his reflection in the mirror. His jaw was clenched, his eyes focused intently on the clasp as if it required all his concentration. When he finished, his hands rested briefly on her shoulders, a rare gesture of affection from a man who showed love through hard work rather than tender words. "Pa," Marianne began, but he was already turning away. "Thomas Hargrove is waiting at the chapel," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "His family arrived an hour ago. Half the county's turned out to see you wed." The mention of Thomas sent an involuntary shiver through Marianne. She pulled her shawl tighter, despite the warmth of the morning. Thomas Hargrove, handsome, charming, heir to the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties. Every unmarried woman in Dust Valley had set her cap at him, and he had chosen her. She should feel fortunate, blessed, even. So why did her hands shake? Why did her stomach twist into knots at the thought of walking down that aisle? "I'll be ready soon," she managed to say. Her parents exchanged a glance, quick but loaded with communication born from decades of marriage. Elizabeth reached out as if to touch her daughter's face, then let her hand fall. "We'll be waiting outside," her father said, ushering his wife from the room. Alone again, Marianne sank onto the edge of her bed. The quilt her grandmother had sewn seemed to offer more comfort than the prospect of her impending nuptials. She thought of Thomas, his easy smile that never quite reached his eyes, his strong hands that could be gentle when others were watching, his temper that flared like prairie fire when things didn't go his way. The bruise on her ribs, hidden beneath layers of cotton and whalebone, throbbed with her heartbeat. It had been an accident, he'd said. She'd startled him when she disagreed about the color of curtains for their future home. He'd been so apologetic afterward, bringing her flowers picked from his mother's garden, promising it would never happen again. But there had been other incidents. The grip on her arm that left purple fingerprints, the shove that sent her stumbling when she'd laughed at something his cousin said, each time followed by gifts, sweet words, and promises of change. "After we're married, everything will be different," she whispered to herself, repeating the mantra that had carried her through the past months. "He's just nervous about the wedding, the pressure from his family. Once we're settled, he'll be the man he was during our courtship." The sound of the church bell broke through her reverie. 1 hour until the ceremony. Marianne rose, smoothing her skirts with determination. This was her choice, her path, her future. Outside her window, the town continued its celebration preparations. The saloon had opened early, offering free drinks to wedding guests. The general store had hung bunting across its facade. Even the typically somber undertaker, Mr. Josiah Pike, had polished his hearse to a shine. Though Marianne tried not to see that as an omen, she didn't notice the lone rider who had just entered town from the east, his dust-covered coat and weathered hat marking him as a drifter. He guided his horse slowly down Main Street, sharp eyes taking in the festivities with the wariness of a man who'd learned to read the undercurrents beneath surface celebrations. The stranger, though none knew his name was Caleb Cross, had planned only to water his horse and purchase supplies before continuing west. But something in the forced gaiety of the townsfolk, the way conversations hushed when certain names were mentioned, made him pause. At the livery stable, he overheard 2 men talking in low voices as they tended their mounts. "Feel sorry for the Miller girl," one muttered. "Pretty little thing like that, marrying into the Hargrove clan." "Hush now. Bill, that's none of our concern. Besides, the Hargroves practically own this town. What choice does she have? Still ain't right. You've seen how that boy treats his horses. Can't imagine he'd be much gentler with a wife." The conversation ended abruptly as they noticed Caleb's presence. He tipped his hat politely, paid for his horse's care, and made his way toward the chapel. Curiosity piqued in his years of wandering. He'd developed an instinct for trouble brewing beneath peaceful facades, back in the Miller home. Marianne took one last look in the mirror. The woman staring back at her wore her mother's dress, her grandmother's cross, and a smile that didn't quite mask the fear in her eyes. But she was a Miller, and Millers didn't run from their responsibilities. With a deep breath that made her ribs ache, she opened her bedroom door and stepped into her future, unaware that fate was about to arrive in the form of a dusty stranger with a steady hand and an uncompromising sense of justice. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across Dust Valley as the town prepared to witness a wedding that would be remembered for generations, though not for the reasons anyone expected. The memories came unbidden as Marianne sat at her vanity, each one sharp as a shard of broken glass. It had started so differently 6 months ago when Thomas Hargrove first took notice of her at the harvest dance. She could still remember how handsome he'd looked that night, his dark hair slicked back, wearing his finest Sunday suit. He'd crossed the entire barn floor to ask her for a dance, ignoring the cluster of eager young women who'd been vying for his attention all evening. Marianne had felt like the heroine in one of those romantic novels her friend Rachel smuggled in from Denver. "Miss Miller," he'd said with that charming smile, "would you honor me with this dance?" For weeks after, he'd courted her properly. Buggy rides along the creek, picnics under the old cottonwood tree, evenings on her parents' porch with Pa keeping a watchful eye from behind his newspaper. Thomas had been everything a young woman could want, attentive, generous, speaking of dreams and plans for their future together. The change had been gradual, so subtle she'd almost missed the warning signs. It started with small criticisms disguised as concern. "That dress makes you look peaked. Darling, why don't you wear the blue one?" Then came the jealousy. "I don't like how that McCarty boy looks at you. You shouldn't smile so much at other men." The first time he'd grabbed her arm in anger, she'd been shocked. They'd been walking by the mill pond, discussing the guest list for their engagement party. She'd suggested inviting her cousin from Cheyenne, and something in Thomas's face had darkened. "No," he'd said flatly. "I don't want that man at our party. But Thomas, he's family. It would be rude not to—" His hand had shot out, fingers wrapping around her upper arm with bruising force. "I said no, Mary Ann. When I make a decision, I expect you to respect it." The mark had lasted a week. 5 purple fingerprints on her pale skin. She'd worn long sleeves despite the summer heat, telling her mother she'd gotten sunsick. Rachel Morrison had been the only one to voice concern. Mary Ann's closest friend since childhood. Rachel had a sharp eye and an even sharper tongue. She'd cornered Mary Ann after church one Sunday, pulling her behind the vestry. "What's he done to you?" Rachel had demanded, her green eyes flashing with anger. "I don't know what you mean," Mary Ann had replied, tugging her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Don't lie to me. Mary Ann Miller, I've known you since we were in pigtails. You've been different these past weeks. Jumpy. And don't think I haven't noticed the bruises you're trying to hide." Mary Ann had broken down then, sobbing into her friend's shoulder. The whole story had poured out. The controlling behavior, the flashes of temper, the way Thomas could switch from rage to tenderness in a heartbeat, leaving her confused and off balance. "Leave him," Rachel had said simply. "Break the engagement. Your parents will understand." "I can't," Mary Ann had whispered. "You don't understand. The Hargroves hold the mortgage on Pa's farm. If I shame them by breaking the engagement—" Rachel's face had gone pale. "They wouldn't. Thomas made sure I understood the consequences. He didn't threaten. Exactly. Just mentioned how difficult things could become for Pa if the Hargroves decided to call in the loan early." The two friends had held each other in silence, the weight of Mary Ann's predicament settling over them like a shroud. As the wedding drew nearer, Thomas's behavior had grown more erratic. He'd backhanded her 3 weeks ago when she'd questioned the household budget he'd drawn up for their marriage. The blow had split her lip, blood staining the handkerchief he'd offered with tender apologies immediately after. "You make me do these things," he'd said, cradling her face with the gentle hands that had just struck her. "If you just listen, if you just trust me to know what's best, I wouldn't lose my temper." She'd believed him, or at least she'd tried to. It was easier than acknowledging the truth, that she was about to bind herself for life to a man who saw her as property to be controlled, rather than a partner to be cherished. Mary Ann rose from the vanity, walking to the window, down on Main Street. She could see the wedding preparations continuing. There was old Mrs. Abernathy, who'd made her wedding cake with her famous rosewater frosting. Mr. Chen from the laundry was hanging white bunting across his storefront, his queue swaying as he worked. Even the saloon girls had put on their finest dresses for the occasion, though they'd be watching from a respectful distance. Her eyes were drawn to a stranger leaning against the hitching post near the general store. Something about his stillness, the way he observed without seeming to watch, marked him as different from the usual drifters who passed through Dust Valley. He wore his gun low on his hip, the mark of a man who knew how to use it, but there was no swagger in his bearing, no attempt to intimidate. As if sensing her gaze, the stranger looked up. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Mary Ann couldn't make out the color of his eyes, but something in his steady regard made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in months. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a gentle acknowledgement and turned away. A knock at her door made her jump. "Come in," she called, smoothing her skirts. It was Rachel, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with a white ribbon. Her friend's face was carefully composed, but Mary Ann could see the concern in her eyes. "I picked these for you," Rachel said, offering the bouquet. "From that meadow where we used to play as girls." Mary Ann accepted the flowers, breathing in their sweet scent. "Thank you." Rachel stepped closer, lowering her voice. "It's not too late. My brother has his wagon ready. We could say you're ill, that you need to see the doctor in the next town. Once you're away—" "Rachel, stop." Mary Ann's voice was firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "I've made my choice. No, The Hargroves made it for you. There's a difference." Marianne turned back to the window, unable to meet her friend's earnest gaze. "What would you have me do? Let my family lose everything? Watch Pa's pride break as the bank takes our land? See Ma forced to take in washing or worse to survive? Your happiness matters too," Rachel insisted. "Does it?" Marianne's laugh was bitter. "In this world, what does a woman's happiness matter against her family's survival?" Rachel pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Then at least take this," she whispered, pressing something small and cold into Marianne's hand. Marianne looked down to find a small derringer, pearl-handled and delicate enough to conceal in her boot. "Rachel, I couldn't—" "You can and you will. If nothing else, it might make him think twice." Rachel's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. "Promise me you'll carry it." After a long moment, Marianne nodded, slipping the tiny gun into her boot. It felt strange against her ankle, a cold reminder that her best friend believed she might need protection from the man she was about to marry. As Rachel helped her with the final preparations, Marianne's mind wandered to all the small compromises she'd already made. The friends Thomas didn't approve of that she no longer saw. The books he considered improper that she'd hidden away. The opinions she'd learned to keep to herself. Was this what marriage would be? A slow erosion of self until nothing remained but what Thomas allowed? Outside, the church bell rang again, half an hour until the ceremony. Marianne squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and prepared to walk the path that had been chosen for her, unaware that sometimes fate provides unexpected detours in the form of mysterious strangers who still believe in honor, justice, and a woman's right to dignity. The morning sun climbed toward its zenith, and shadows grew short in Dust Valley as the moment of reckoning approached. The small wooden chapel of Dust Valley had never seen such a gathering. Every pew was packed with townspeople dressed in their Sunday finest, the air thick with the scent of lavender water and bay rum pomade. Sunlight streamed through the plain glass windows, casting geometric patterns across the worn floorboards that had witnessed countless baptisms, funerals, and weddings over the past 2 decades. At the altar, Reverend Josiah Whitmore stood with his worn Bible, his kindly face betraying none of the unease he felt. He'd married many couples in his 30 years of ministry, but something about this union troubled him. Perhaps it was the way Thomas Hargrove's jaw tightened whenever anyone spoke to his bride-to-be, or how the young woman herself seemed to shrink in his presence. The front pews were occupied by the town's elite. Judge Harrison and his wife sat ramrod straight, their presence lending an air of official approval to the proceedings. Doc Muller had closed his practice for the morning, sitting beside the schoolmarm, Miss Prudence Shaw. The Hargrove family commanded the entire right side of the chapel. Thomas's parents, stern-faced William and perpetually nervous Charlotte, along with various cousins and business associates who'd made the journey from neighboring counties. Thomas stood at the altar, resplendent in a black frock coat and silk vest that probably cost more than most families in Dust Valley saw in a year. His dark hair was oiled to perfection, his boots polished to a mirror shine. To most observers, he appeared the picture of a prosperous young gentleman awaiting his bride. Only those who looked closely might notice how his fingers drummed impatiently against his thigh, or how his eyes kept darting to the door with barely concealed irritation. The organist, elderly Mrs. Dietrich, began playing a wavering rendition of a processional hymn. The congregation rose to their feet, turning expectantly toward the entrance. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, the joining of 2 prominent families, a union that would strengthen business ties and social connections throughout the valley. In the very last pew, half hidden in shadow, Caleb Cross sat quietly. He'd entered just as the chapel doors were closing, slipping in with the unobtrusive skill of a man accustomed to going unnoticed when it suited him. His hat rested on the pew beside him, revealing sandy hair touched with premature silver at the temples. His gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over the prairie, took in every detail of the scene. He'd spent the past hour listening to gossip in the saloon and general store, piecing together the story of this wedding, the Hargrove family's wealth and influence, The Miller family struggles to keep their farm afloat. The bride's sudden change from vivacious young woman to quiet, nervous creature who startled at shadows. The pieces formed a picture he'd seen too many times before in too many frontier towns. The chapel doors opened, and Samuel Miller appeared with his daughter on his arm. A collective intake of breath rippled through the congregation as they took in Mary Ann's appearance. Despite the aged wedding dress and simple arrangement of wildflowers, she possessed a natural beauty that no amount of finery could enhance or diminish. Her face was pale but composed, her steps measured and steady. As they began the long walk down the aisle, Caleb noticed things others might miss. The way Mary Ann's father gripped her arm as if afraid she might bolt. The slight tremor in her bouquet despite her steady pace. The way her eyes fixed on some point beyond the altar, as if looking through rather than at her waiting groom. Thomas's expression shifted as he watched her approach, what might have passed for admiration to casual observers. Caleb recognized as possession. The young man looked at his bride the way a rancher might survey a prize heifer, with satisfaction at his acquisition and calculation of future benefits. Halfway down the aisle, Mary Ann's eyes swept across the congregation. She saw familiar faces, neighbors who'd known her since childhood, friends from school, the women who'd helped raise her after her mother fell ill that terrible winter. Their expressions ranged from genuine happiness to barely concealed concern. When her gaze found Rachel Morrison, her friend's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Then, in the back pew, she noticed the stranger from earlier. He sat with the perfect stillness of a man comfortable with himself, neither fidgeting with discomfort nor leaning forward with eager curiosity. Their eyes met for the second time that day, and something in his steady regard gave her the strength to continue walking. Samuel Miller delivered his daughter to the altar with visible reluctance. As he placed Mary Ann's hand in Thomas's, he murmured something too low for others to hear. Thomas's smile tightened imperceptibly, but he nodded with exaggerated respect before turning to face the Reverend with his bride. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Whitmore began, his voice carrying the weight of tradition. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over the congregation like a well-worn blanket. Some followed along in their prayer books, others simply listened with varying degrees of attention. In the third pew, Rachel Morrison gripped her handkerchief so tightly her knuckles turned white. She'd noticed the way Thomas had squeezed Mary Ann's hand when he took it, saw her friend's almost imperceptible wince. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, soberly, and in the fear of God. The Reverend continued, "Into this holy estate these two persons present come now to be joined." Caleb shifted slightly, his movement drawing Thomas's attention. The groom's eyes narrowed as he took in the stranger's presence, clearly displeased by any unfamiliar face at his wedding. The two men regarded each other for a moment, Thomas with territorial hostility, Caleb with calm assessment. Then Thomas dismissed him with a slight sneer. Turning back to the ceremony, the Reverend had reached the exchange of vows. "Thomas James Hargrove, wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live?" "I will," Thomas declared, his voice ringing with confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Mary Ann Elizabeth Miller, wilt thou have this man to be thy wedded husband, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou obey him, and serve him, love, honor, and keep him, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto him, so long as ye both shall live?" The chapel fell silent. Mary Ann's lips parted, but no sound emerged. The pause stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Thomas's grip on her hands tightened visibly. Several people shifted in their seats. Charlotte Hargrove fanned herself more rapidly. Mary Ann's voice was barely a whisper. She cleared her throat. Tried again. "I will." Relief rippled through the congregation. though whether at the ceremony continuing or at some averted crisis, none could say. Reverend Whitmore proceeded to the blessing of the rings, producing a simple gold band from his vestments. "Bless, O Lord, this ring, that he who gives it and she who wears it may abide in thy peace and continue in thy favor unto their life's end. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen." Thomas took the ring with steady hands. As he reached for Mary Ann's left hand, she trembled so violently that the small bouquet of wildflowers slipped from her grasp. The flowers scattered across the altar steps, white petals stark against the dark wood. "Clumsy," Thomas muttered, loud enough for the first few pews to hear. His tone held a warning that made several people shift uncomfortably. Mary Ann dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the scattered blooms, her face flushed with mortification as Thomas stood rigid above her, making no move to help. The congregation watched in awkward silence, uncertain whether to assist or remain in their places. From the back of the chapel, Caleb Cross rose to his feet. His movement was unhurried but purposeful, drawing every eye as he walked down the aisle. His boots made soft thuds against the wooden floor, the sound somehow ominous in the hushed space. When he reached the altar, he crouched beside Mary Ann, his large hands gentle as he helped gather the scattered flowers. "Steady now, miss," he said quietly, his voice carrying a subtle Western drawl. "No harm done." Their fingers brushed as he handed her a recovered bloom. Up close, she could see that his eyes were indeed gray, like storm clouds, but with unexpected warmth in their depths. He helped her to her feet with old-fashioned courtesy, ensuring she was steady before stepping back. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas's face had darkened to an alarming shade. "And who might you be, sir, to interrupt my wedding?" Caleb regarded him calmly. "Just a traveler passing through, friend, meant no disrespect." He touched his hat brim to the Reverend. "Pardon the interruption, Reverend." He returned to his pew with the same unhurried pace, seemingly oblivious to the dozens of eyes following his movement and the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Thomas's jaw worked as if he were chewing on words he couldn't speak in church. The ceremony resumed, though the atmosphere had shifted. Where before there had been festive anticipation, now an undercurrent of unease ran through the chapel like a cold draft. Mary Ann clutched her partially restored bouquet, acutely aware of Thomas's rigid posture beside her, as Reverend Whitmore asked for the ring once more. Everyone held their breath, wondering what would happen next in what was supposed to be the social event of the season, but was rapidly becoming something else entirely. The ring slipped from Mary Ann's trembling fingers, hitting the wooden floor with a metallic ping that seemed to echo through the chapel like a gunshot. It rolled in a lazy arc, coming to rest against the altar rail. The congregation held its collective breath as she stood frozen, her face draining of what little color remained. Thomas's expression transformed in an instant. The mask of genteel courtesy he'd worn throughout the ceremony cracked and fell away, revealing something dark and ugly beneath. His hand moved with shocking speed, striking Mary Ann across the face with enough force to snap her head to the side. The sharp crack of flesh against flesh shattered the sacred atmosphere of the chapel. Mary Ann stumbled, her hand flying to her cheek, blood already beginning to seep from where Thomas's ring had cut her lip. "You worthless, clumsy fool!" Thomas snarled, his cultured accent slipping to reveal rougher origins. "Can't even manage a simple wedding without shaming me in front of the entire town." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Women clutched their husbands' arms. Children shrank against their parents, but no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the Hargrove family's influence pressed down on the chapel like a physical force, paralyzing even those who might otherwise have intervened. William Hargrove half rose from his pew, not to stop his son, but to block the aisle, his bulk a clear warning to anyone who might think to interfere. His face showed no surprise, only cold calculation as he assessed the damage to the family's reputation. Mary Ann's knees buckled, and she sank to the altar steps, her mother's wedding dress pooling around her like spilled cream. Blood dripped onto the white fabric, each drop a crimson accusation. Her father started forward, but Thomas wheeled on him. "Stay where you are, old man," he commanded. "Your daughter needs to learn her place, and if you'd done your job properly, I wouldn't have to teach her." Samuel Miller's weathered face contorted with rage and anguish, but he remained rooted to the spot. Everyone knew what defying the Hargroves meant. His farm, his family's survival, everything hung in the balance. Reverend Whitmore stood frozen behind the altar, his Bible clutched uselessly to his chest. "Mr. Hargrove," he ventured weakly, "surely this is not—" "Shut your mouth, preacher," Thomas snapped, "unless you want to find yourself ministering to empty pews come Sunday." The silence that followed was deafening. 400 souls packed into the small chapel, and not one found the courage to speak. Rachel Morrison had half risen from her seat, tears streaming down her face, but her brother held her back, whispering urgently about consequences and survival. Then, cutting through the suffocating quiet like a blade through silk, came the unmistakable sound of a hammer being cocked. Every head turned to the back of the chapel where Caleb Cross stood in the center aisle, his Colt .45 drawn and aimed steadily at Thomas Hargrove. The stranger's gray eyes had gone cold as winter steel, his earlier calm replaced by something far more dangerous. "That's enough," Caleb said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down worse than spoiled rich boys. "Step away from the lady." Thomas's face flushed purple with rage. "How dare you? Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly what you are," Caleb replied, advancing down the aisle with measured steps. "You're a coward who beats women. Seen plenty of your type. They all bleed the same color." William Hargrove lurched to his feet. "You'll hang for this, drifter. I'll see to it personally." Caleb's gun never wavered from Thomas. "Maybe so, but your boy will be in the ground long before they stretch my neck." He'd reached the front of the chapel now, positioning himself between Thomas and Mary Ann. "I said step back." Thomas's hand moved toward the derringer he kept in his vest pocket, but Caleb's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't! You're not fast enough, and we both know it." The younger man's hand froze. Up close, he could see the truth in the stranger's eyes. This wasn't some farm boy playing at being dangerous. This was a man who'd killed before and would do so again without losing sleep over it. "You don't understand," Thomas blustered, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. "She's my wife. I have the right—" "No," Caleb interrupted. "She's not your wife yet, and even if she were, no man has the right to strike a woman. Not in church, not anywhere. A real man protects those weaker than himself. He doesn't prey on them." He glanced down at Mary Ann, who was staring up at him with a mixture of shock and dawning hope. "Can you stand, miss?" She nodded slowly, accepting the hand he offered with his free arm. As she rose unsteadily to her feet, the blood on her lips stood out starkly against her pale skin. Several women in the congregation began to weep openly at the sight. "This is outrageous!" Charlotte Hargrove shrieked from her pew. "Marshal Wheeler! Arrest this man immediately!" The town marshal, a paunchy man who owed his position to Hargrove influence, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but made no move to rise. He'd seen the speed with which the stranger had drawn his weapon, the steady hand that betrayed long practice. More importantly, he'd seen the look in the man's eyes. Wheeler had survived 20 years as a lawman by knowing which fights to avoid. "Marshall seems to be having trouble hearing you, ma'am," Caleb observed dryly. "Maybe because he knows that what I'm doing is what he should have done the moment your son struck this lady." He addressed the congregation without taking his eyes off Thomas. "You all saw what happened here. Saw a man strike his bride for dropping a ring. If you let this marriage continue, you're giving him permission to do worse behind closed doors. Every bruise, every broken bone, every tear she sheds will be on your conscience." "You don't know anything about it," Thomas spat. "She needs discipline. She's willful, clumsy, stupid." The gun in Caleb's hand shifted slightly, and Thomas's words died in his throat. "Keep talking," Caleb said softly. "Give me a reason." Marianne found her voice at last. "He's right," she said, her words initially quiet but gaining strength. "Thomas has been hurting me for months. Threats, bruises, controlling everything I do. I tried to tell myself it would get better after we married, but—" She touched her bleeding lip. "Now you've all seen the truth." "Lying witch!" Thomas roared, lunging toward her. Caleb's response was swift and brutal. The barrel of his Colt connected with Thomas's temple, dropping him to the altar steps like a felled oak. The sound of his body hitting the floor was followed by a collective gasp from the congregation. "Anyone else?" Caleb asked mildly, surveying the Hargrove family section. William had gone pale, his blustering confidence evaporating in the face of real violence. "No. Good." He holstered his weapon and turned to Marianne, his voice gentling. "You don't have to marry him. No debt, no threat. Nothing is worth binding yourself to a man like that." "But my family," she began. "We'll survive," he finished. "There are other towns, other opportunities, but you won't survive him. Women like you don't just disappear or fall downstairs or die in childbirth complications that look suspiciously like beatings. Seen it too many times." Samuel Miller finally found his courage, pushing past William Hargrove to reach his daughter. "He's right. Marianne, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let it come to this. No farm is worth my daughter's life." As father and daughter embraced, the spell that had held the congregation broke. People began to murmur, then talk, then argue. Some defended the Hargroves, speaking of tradition and a husband's rights. Others, emboldened by the stranger's actions, voiced what they'd been thinking all along. Rachel Morrison rushed to her friend's side, pulling out a handkerchief to dab at the blood on Marianne's lip. "Thank God," she whispered. "Thank God someone finally did something." Thomas groaned and stirred on the floor. His mother rushed to him, cradling his head and shooting venomous looks at everyone around her. But the fear that had kept the town in line for so long had cracked, and like a dam with a fissure, it was only a matter of time before it broke completely. Caleb Cross stood apart from the commotion, watchful and ready. He'd upset the balance of power in Dust Valley with a single act of intervention. The consequences would come, they always did. But for now, a young woman stood free of her chains, and that was enough. The morning sun had reached its zenith, shining through the chapel windows to illuminate a scene that would be whispered about for generations. The wedding that had promised to unite two families had instead revealed the rot at the heart of one, and shown that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. Thomas Hargrove pushed himself up from the altar floor, blood trickling from the gash on his temple where Caleb's gun had struck him. His perfectly styled hair now hung in disarray, his fine clothes rumpled and stained. But it was the look in his eyes that made several people step back, a wild, dangerous fury that promised retribution. "You'll pay for this," he snarled, wiping blood from his face with the back of his hand. "Nobody strikes a Hargrove and lives to tell about it." Caleb stood between Thomas and Marianne, his stance relaxed but ready. The Colt remained holstered, but his hand rested casually near it. "That's where you're wrong, boy. I've faced down Apache warriors, Confederate raiders, and men a lot meaner than you. You don't scare me." "Thomas, enough." William Hargrove had found his voice again, though it lacked its usual commanding tone. "We're leaving. Now." "No." Thomas shook off his mother's restraining hand. "This saddle tramp humiliated me in front of the entire town. He dies today. Not in my church." Reverend Whitmore finally spoke up, his voice trembling but determined. "There will be no more violence in this house of God." Thomas laughed, an ugly sound that held no humor. "Your church? Old man, my family owns this church. We own this whole town, and after today, you'll be lucky if we let you preach to the chickens. Then perhaps it's time that changed," a new voice said from the congregation. Judge Harrison stood up, his dignified bearing commanding attention. He'd served Dust Valley for 15 years, walking a careful line between justice and survival under Hargrove influence. But something about seeing a young woman struck at the altar had finally tipped the scales. "William," The judge addressed the elder Hargrove. Your family has contributed much to this town's prosperity, but prosperity without justice is just tyranny with a prettier face. Ethan, you don't know what you're saying, William warned. Think about your position. I am, Judge Harrison replied firmly. And I'm thinking about all the times I've looked the other way. All the accidents on your ranch. The workers who disappeared. The young women who left town suddenly with no explanation. He looked at Marianne with something like shame. I should have spoken up sooner. A murmur ran through the congregation. The judge's words had given voice to suspicions many had harbored but never dared express. In the pews, people began to shift, some moving subtly away from the Hargrove section as if distancing themselves from contagion. "You're all fools!" Charlotte Hargrove shrieked, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Without us, this town would dry up and blow away. The bank, the mill, the cattle contracts, we control everything." "Maybe that's the problem," Doc Muller said, rising to stand beside the judge. The elderly physician had tended to too many injuries he'd been told were accidents, treated too many women who flinched when their husbands moved too quickly. Maybe it's time Dust Valley learned to stand on its own feet. Thomas's face had gone from red to purple. "You'll all regret this, every last one of you." He turned to Caleb, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Especially you, Drifter. I challenge you, right here, right now. Let's settle this like men." "Thomas, no!" His mother clutched at his arm, but he shook her off violently. Caleb studied the younger man with something almost like pity. "You sure about that, boy? I'm giving you a chance to walk away." "Coward," Thomas spat. "All talk, no action." "What's wrong? Scared to face me in a fair fight?" Marianne stepped forward, her voice stronger now despite her split lip. "Don't do this, please. No more violence." Caleb glanced at her, something softening in his gray eyes. "Sometimes, Miss Violence is the only language men like him understand." He turned back to Thomas. "But I won't draw on you here. This is a church. You want to settle this. We do it outside. Proper-like." "Fine," Thomas agreed immediately. "Main Street, 10 minutes. "Thomas, I forbid this," William Hargrove commanded, but his son was beyond listening. "Either you're with me or against me. Father," Thomas said coldly. "Choose." The chapel erupted into chaos. People pushed toward the doors, some eager to witness the confrontation, others desperate to escape before bullets started flying. Marianne found herself swept along in the crowd, Rachel and her father flanking her protectively. "This is madness," Samuel Miller muttered. "That boy doesn't stand a chance against a man like Cross." "Good," Rachel said fiercely. "Maybe it's time someone taught the Hargroves that money can't buy everything." Outside, the noon sun beat down mercilessly on Main Street. Word spread like wildfire, and people emerged from shops and saloons to line the dusty thoroughfare. Within minutes, it seemed the entire town had gathered to witness the showdown. Caleb walked to the center of the street with unhurried steps, his spurs jingling softly. He'd removed his coat, revealing a well-worn gun belt and the ivory-handled Colt that had seen him through more fights than he cared to remember. His movements were economical, professional, a stark contrast to Thomas's theatrical preparations. The younger man made a show of checking his weapon, a fancy nickel-plated revolver that had probably never been fired in anger. His hands shook slightly as he loaded it, though whether from rage or fear, none could say. "It's not too late," Marshal Wheeler attempted weakly. "This doesn't have to happen." "Shut up, Wheeler," William Hargrove growled. "You've done enough nothing for one day." Marianne stood on the boardwalk in front of the general store, her wedding dress now stained with blood and dust. The derringer Rachel had given her pressed against her ankle, a cold reminder of how this day had spiraled so far from what anyone had expected. "Please," she called out to Caleb, "you don't have to do this for me." He touched the brim of his hat without taking his eyes off Thomas. "Not doing it for you, miss, doing it because it needs doing. Men like him, they're like rabid dogs. You can't reason with them. You can't reform them. You can only stop them." "Enough talk," Thomas shouted from the other end of the street. "Let's finish this." The crowd fell silent. Even the horses tied to the hitching posts seemed to sense the tension, stamping nervously. Somewhere, a dog barked once and was quickly hushed. Caleb stood perfectly still, his hand relaxed at his side. He'd learned long ago that the key to surviving gunfights wasn't speed. It was certainty. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no doubt. Thomas, by contrast, practically vibrated with nervous energy. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the dry heat. His fancy clothes, so impressive in the chapel, now seemed like a costume on a player ill-suited for his role. "On the count of 3, Marshal Wheeler said reluctantly, positioning himself well out of the line of fire. 1. Marianne closed her eyes, unable to watch. Rachel gripped her hand tightly. 2. William Hargrove's face had gone gray. He'd bullied and blustered his way through life, but he'd never watched his son face death before. 3. The silence exploded into chaos. Thomas's hand jerked toward his gun, but he'd barely cleared leather when Caleb's Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic. The single shot echoed off the buildings like thunder. Thomas's fancy revolver spun from his nerveless fingers, landing in the dust several feet away. He clutched his right hand to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers where Caleb's bullet had torn through his palm. "My hand!" he screamed, dropping to his knees. "You shot my hand!" Caleb holstered his weapon with the same fluid motion he'd drawn it. "Be grateful that's all I shot. You'll live. You'll never draw a gun with that hand again, but you'll live." He walked over to where Thomas knelt in the dust, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Listen close, boy, because I'll only say this once. You're done here. Done hurting women. Done terrorizing this town. You and your family are going to leave Dust Valley, and you're never coming back. You can't—" William Hargrove started forward, but stopped when Caleb's cold gaze fixed on him. "Yes, I can. And I will. You've got a week to settle your affairs and get out. After that, if I see any of you within 50 miles of this place, we'll have another conversation. And next time, I won't aim for the hand." As Doc Muller rushed to tend Thomas's wound, the crowd began to stir. Conversations broke out. Quiet at first, then louder. The impossible had happened. Someone had stood up to the Hargroves and won. Marianne opened her eyes to find it was over. The man who'd terrorized her for months was defeated, reduced to a whimpering boy clutching a ruined hand. And the stranger who'd intervened, who'd risked everything for a woman he didn't even know, stood tall in the dusty street, a figure from one of those dime novels come to life. But this was no story. This was real. And the consequences of this day would ripple through Dust Valley like stones thrown in still water. The old order had been shattered. What would rise in its place remained to be seen. The news spread through Dust Valley like wildfire on dry prairie grass. By evening, every household, saloon and boarding house buzzed with talk of the morning's dramatic events. The impossible had happened. Someone had faced down the Hargroves and lived to tell the tale. In the modest parlor of the Miller farmhouse, Marianne sat with a cold compress against her swollen lip, while Rachel tended to her. The blood had been cleaned from her mother's wedding dress, though the stains would never fully fade. Through the window, they could see neighbors approaching, some bringing food, others simply wanting to show support now that it was safe to do so. "Hypocrites," Rachel muttered, watching Mrs. Patterson waddle up the path with a covered dish. "Where were they when Thomas was hitting you in the church?" "They were scared," Marianne said quietly. "Just like I was. We can't blame them for that." Samuel Miller paced the small room, his weathered hands clenching and unclenching. "I should have protected you. Should have stood up to them months ago when this all started." "Pa, stop." Marianne reached for his hand. "The Hargroves would have destroyed us." "You did what you thought was best." A knock at the door interrupted them. Samuel opened it to find Judge Harrison standing on the porch, hat in hand. "Samuel, Miss Miller." The judge nodded gravely. "May I come in?" They gathered in the parlor, the judge looking uncomfortable in the simple surroundings. He'd rarely ventured to this part of town, preferring the comfort of his well-appointed home near the courthouse. "I've come to apologize," he began without preamble, "and to discuss what happens next. The Hargroves won't leave quietly. William's already at the bank, trying to call in every loan, every debt. He means to burn this town down financially before he goes." "Can he do that?" Samuel asked, his face paling. "He can try, but I've been thinking." The judge leaned forward. "What if the town fought back? What if we refused to let one family hold us hostage anymore?" Meanwhile, across town at the Dust Valley Inn, Caleb Cross sat in the small dining room, working his way through a plate of beef and beans. He'd changed out of his dusty clothes, but kept his gun belt on. Old habits died hard. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, stealing glances when they thought he wasn't looking. The innkeeper, a nervous man named Josiah Polk, approached with a coffee pot. "On the house. Mr. Cross, everything's on the house. What you did today. I didn't do it for free drinks," Caleb said mildly. "Just did what needed doing. Still, the whole town's grateful. Well, most of it anyway." Polk lowered his voice. "The Hargroves have barricaded themselves in their big house. Word is they're bringing in hired guns from Amarillo." Caleb sipped his coffee thoughtfully. He'd expected as much. Men like William Hargrove didn't give up power easily. They'd rather see everything burn than admit defeat. The inn door opened, and Mary Ann entered, causing a stir among the diners. She'd changed from her wedding dress into a simple calico frock, her face bearing the bruise from Thomas's blow, but her bearing straighter than it had been in months. She walked directly to Caleb's table. "May I sit?" He stood, pulling out a chair for her with old-fashioned courtesy. "It's your town. Miss, you can sit wherever you please." "That's just it," she said once seated. "It hasn't been our town for a long time. The Hargroves made sure of that. But today, you gave us hope that it could be again." "Hope's a dangerous thing," Caleb warned. "Makes people do foolish things." "Like standing up to bullies? Like refusing to marry a man who beats you?" Mary Ann's chin lifted. "If that's foolish, then I'll gladly be a fool." Caleb studied her, noting the steel beneath the soft exterior. "You've got sand. Miss, I'll give you that, but this isn't over." "Men like the Hargroves, they don't forget. They'll come for me, and they'll come for anyone who stands with me. Then we'll face them together," a new voice said. They turned to see a crowd gathering in the inn's entrance. Judge Harrison was there, along with Doc Muller, Marshal Wheeler looking sheepish but determined, and at least a dozen other townspeople. "We've been talking," the judge continued. "The Hargroves own the bank, but the bank's charter comes from the state. If we can prove financial malfeasance, and I believe we can petition for new management." "They own the mill too," added Henrik Larsson, the Norwegian carpenter. "But they don't own our hands or our backs. We built this town. We can run it without them." Marshal Wheeler stepped forward, removing his badge. "I've been a coward and a bought man, but no more." He held the badge out to Caleb. "The town needs a real lawman, someone who can't be bought or intimidated." Caleb shook his head. "I'm no lawman, just a drifter passing through." "You were," Mary Ann said softly. "But maybe you could be more. Maybe Dust Valley could be a place worth staying for." Before Caleb could respond, the inn door burst open. A young boy, Tommy Chen from the laundry, ran in breathless and wide-eyed. "They're coming," he gasped. "The Hargroves. They've got men with them, strangers with guns. They're heading for the jail." The crowd tensed, fear rippling through them. This was the test. Would they stand their ground or scatter like they always had? Caleb rose slowly, checking his Colt. "How many?" "8, maybe 10. Mister, Hargrove is shouting about arresting you for attempted murder." "On whose authority?" Judge Harrison demanded. "I'm the law in this county, and I've issued no such warrant." "Don't think that matters to them." "Judge," Caleb said. He looked around the room at the frightened but determined faces. "Anyone who walks out that door with me is putting their life on the line." "No shame in staying inside?" Mary Ann stood first. "I'm going." "Mary Ann, no," her father protested, but she cut him off. I've spent months being afraid. Pa, I won't live that way anymore." She pulled the small derringer from her pocket, checking its load. "Besides, someone needs to make sure Mr. Cross doesn't face them alone." One by one, others stood. Judge Harrison, Doc Mueller, Henrik Larson, even timid Josiah Polk. Soon, most of the room was on their feet. Marshal Wheeler pinned his badge back on. "Guess I've got one more job to do before I retire." He looked at Caleb. "What's the plan?" Caleb allowed himself a small smile. "The plan is, we show the Hargroves that Dust Valley isn't their personal kingdom anymore. We do this legal and proper, but we don't back down." They filed out of the inn into the gathering dusk. Word had spread, and more townspeople emerged from shops and homes, some carrying guns, others simply standing witness. By the time they reached Main Street, they were no longer a handful of rebels but a community united. At the jail, William Hargrove sat mounted on his black stallion, flanked by hard-faced men who had the look of hired killers. Thomas was there too, his hand heavily bandaged, hatred burning in his eyes. "There he is." William pointed at Caleb. "Arrest that man for the attempted murder of my son." Marshal Wheeler stepped forward. "Mr. Hargrove, your son drew first in a legal duel. Multiple witnesses will testify to that. There's no crime here except the assault your son committed in the church." "You dare." William's face purpled. "I own you, Wheeler." "No, sir," Wheeler replied steadily. "You used to, but I've remembered what this badge means, and it doesn't mean serving the highest bidder." The hired guns shifted restlessly, hands hovering near their weapons. The townspeople behind Caleb tensed, fingers tightening on their own guns. The air crackled with the promise of violence. "You've lost, Hargrove." Judge Harrison called out. "Leave now with what dignity you have left, or stay and face justice for years of corruption and abuse of power." "This isn't over," William snarled. "You think you've won? I'll destroy this town. I'll salt the earth so nothing grows here again." "Try it," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "But remember, I'll be watching, and next time we meet, I won't be as generous as I was with your boy." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other, the future of Dust Valley hanging in the balance. Then, slowly, William Hargrove turned his horse. "We're leaving," he commanded his men, "but this isn't finished." As they rode away, a cheer went up from the crowd. People embraced, laughed, cried. For the first time in years, they'd stood up to tyranny and won. Marianne found herself standing next to Caleb, watching the Hargroves disappear into the darkness. "Thank you," she said simply. He looked down at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me what's worth fighting for." The stars were coming out over Dust Valley, and for the first time in a long time, they seemed to shine with hope. The courthouse was packed to overflowing 3 days later. Judge Harrison had called for a special town meeting, and it seemed every soul in Dust Valley had crowded into the modest building. The windows were thrown open to accommodate those who couldn't fit inside, their faces pressed against the glass to hear the proceedings. Marianne sat in the front row between her parents, her bruised face now fading to yellow and green. She wore a simple blue dress, her grandmother's cross at her throat. The wedding dress had been carefully folded away, not destroyed, but preserved as a reminder of the day everything changed. "Order! Order!" Wham! Judge Harrison gavelled the meeting to attention. "We're here today to address matters of vital importance to our community. But first, I believe we need to hear some truths that have been hidden too long." He nodded to Marianne, who rose on unsteady legs. The room fell silent as she made her way to the witness stand typically reserved for criminal trials. Her hands trembled as she gripped the rail, but her voice was clear. "My name is Marianne Miller," she began, "and I need to tell you about Thomas Hargrove." For the next 20 minutes, she spoke about the controlling behavior that started almost immediately after their engagement, the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, the threats against her family if she tried to leave, The escalating violence that culminated in that terrible moment at the altar. When she finished, the silence was deafening. Then, slowly, another woman stood. Mrs. Ellen Weatherby, the banker's wife, walked to the stand with dignity despite her obvious nervousness. "My daughter worked as a maid at the Hargrove Ranch 2 years ago," she said quietly. "She came home one night with her dress torn and bruises on her arms. She wouldn't say what happened, but she never went back. A week later, the Hargroves paid for her to go live with relatives in San Francisco. They said it was a kindness, but we all knew it was to keep her quiet." One by one, others came forward. The ranch hand who'd seen Thomas beat a horse to death for throwing him. The shopkeeper who'd been threatened when he asked for payment on the Hargrove account. The widow who'd lost her home when she couldn't pay the inflated interest on a loan from the Hargrove-owned bank. Doc Muller testified about injuries he'd treated. Broken bones, cuts, bruises, always with flimsy explanations and warnings not to ask questions. "I violated my oath as a physician," he admitted. "I put fear above my duty to protect those who needed help." As the testimonies continued, a picture emerged of a family that had held Dust Valley in a grip of fear and corruption for over a decade. The crowd's mood shifted from shock to anger to determination. Finally, Judge Harrison called for order again. "The evidence is overwhelming. The Hargrove family has abused their power, violated numerous laws, and terrorized this community. As circuit judge, I'm issuing warrants for the arrest of William and Thomas Hargrove on charges of assault, extortion, and corruption." A cheer went up, but the judge wasn't finished. "However, we have a problem. The Hargroves have retreated to their ranch with a small army of hired guns. Marshal Wheeler can't arrest them alone." "He won't be alone," Caleb Cross said from the back of the room. He'd been standing quietly against the wall, observing. Now he walked forward, his spurs ringing in the sudden silence. "I'll ride with him." "As will I," Henrik Larson declared, standing tall despite his 50 years. "And I," added James Chen, the laundry owner whose son had raised the alarm days before. Soon, a dozen men had volunteered. Then 2 dozen. Even some women stepped forward, including Rachel Morrison, who glared at anyone who dared suggest she stay behind. "This could turn into a bloodbath," Marshal Wheeler warned. "The Hargroves won't come peacefully." "Then maybe they need more incentive," Mary Ann suggested. All eyes turned to her. "What if we hit them where it really hurts their money?" Judge Harrison leaned forward. "What do you have in mind, Miss Miller?" "The bank, the mill, the trading contracts. It's all built on paper, isn't it? Legal documents, loans, deeds." She looked around the room. "What if we refused to honor any of it? What if the whole town simply stopped recognizing their claims?" That's revolutionary," the judge said slowly, "and possibly illegal." "So was everything they did to us," Mary Ann countered. "They used the law as a weapon. Maybe it's time we used it as a shield." The debate raged for hours. Some argued for caution, others for immediate action. But as the sun began to set, a consensus emerged. The town would stand together. They would freeze all Hargrove assets, refuse to honor their loans, and support the marshal in serving the arrest warrants. "We'll need to be organized," Judge Harrison said. "Form committees. Defense, finance, supplies. This could be a siege." As people volunteered for various duties, Caleb found himself beside Mary Ann on the courthouse steps. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of sage from the surrounding plains. "You started something here," he said. "Takes courage to speak truth when you've been taught to stay silent." "I had a good example," she replied, glancing at him. "You showed me it was possible to stand up to them." "I just pulled a gun." "You're changing hearts and minds. That's harder and more lasting." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as their neighbors organized with newfound purpose. Children ran between the adults' legs, sensing the excitement without understanding its source. Somewhere, a fiddle started playing, and despite everything, People began to smile. "Mr. Cross," Marianne said suddenly. "That day in the church, when you helped me pick up my flowers, why did you do it?" He considered the question. "My mother used to say that you could judge a man by how he treats those who can't fight back. When I saw him standing over you, not lifting a finger to help." He shrugged. "Some things just aren't right. And if good people don't act, evil wins by default. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She died when I was 15. Fever took her one winter." His voice was distant, lost in memory. "She would have liked you, said the frontier needed more women with backbone." Before Marianne could respond, Marshal Wheeler approached. "We're riding out at dawn, figure to catch them off guard. I'll be ready." Caleb nodded. "So will I," Marianne added. Both men turned to her in surprise. "Now, miss," Wheeler began, but she cut him off. "I'm going. This started with me, and I'll see it through. Besides," she patted the derringer in her pocket, "I'm armed." Caleb and Wheeler exchanged glances. "She's got sand," Caleb said finally. "Might be we could use someone with medical training if Doc Muller's coming too." "I've been helping Doc for years," Marianne confirmed. "I can handle myself." As the meeting broke up and people headed home to prepare, Rachel approached. "You're really going to ride with them?" "I have to," Marianne said. "I can't ask others to risk their lives while I hide at home." Rachel hugged her fiercely. "Then I'm coming too. Someone needs to keep you from doing anything too heroic." The two friends walked home together, past buildings that had stood in Hargrove's shadows for too long. Tomorrow would bring danger, possibly death. But tonight, for the first time in years, Dust Valley felt like a free town. At the Miller farm, Marianne found her mother waiting on the porch. Elizabeth had aged years in the past few days, but there was something different in her bearing, a straightness of spine that had been missing. "I heard what you're planning," her mother said. "Ma, I'm proud of you." Elizabeth pulled her daughter into an embrace. "Scared to death, but proud. You're doing what I never had the courage to do." They held each other as the stars came out, neither speaking of the fears that tomorrow would bring. Inside, Samuel Miller cleaned his old army rifle, preparing to defend his home if the Hargroves tried to retaliate. Across town, Caleb Cross sat in his room at the inn, methodically cleaning his weapons. He'd drifted for years, avoiding attachments, staying ahead of his past. But something about this place, these people and one brave young woman in particular, had awakened something he'd thought long dead. Tomorrow, they would face the Hargroves, win or lose. Dust Valley would never be the same, and neither would he. Dawn broke over the plains like spilled gold, painting the grasslands in hues of amber and rose. The posse had assembled at the edge of town, 30 souls united in purpose, though their faces showed the strain of what lay ahead. Marshal Wheeler sat his horse at the front, the star on his chest catching the early light. Beside him, Caleb Cross checked his rifle one last time, his movements calm and practiced. Marianne rode between her father and Rachel, both of whom had insisted on coming despite her protests. She'd traded her dress for split riding skirts and a practical blouse, her mother's wedding dress left behind like a shed skin. The derringer was in her boot now, a Colt .32 her father had given her holstered at her hip. "The Hargrove Ranch is 5 miles north," Wheeler addressed the group. "We'll approach from the east, using Miller's Canyon for cover. Remember, we're serving legal warrants. We're not vigilantes." They rode in relative silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. As they neared the ranch, Caleb raised his hand, bringing the column to a halt. "Smoke," he said quietly, pointing to black columns rising beyond the ridge. "Too much for chimney fires." They crested the hill to find chaos. The Hargrove Ranch was in flames, the main house already half consumed. Gunfire crackled from the outbuildings where the hired guns had taken cover, but they weren't shooting at the posse. They were fighting each other. "What in blazes?" Wheeler muttered. A figure broke from the burning barn, running toward them. It was one of the Hargrove ranch hands, his clothes singed and face blackened with soot. "Thank God," he gasped, collapsing to his knees. "They've gone mad. The old man and Thomas, they started shooting everyone. Said if they couldn't have the ranch, no one would." More gunfire erupted from the main house. Through the smoke, they could see William Hargrove on the upper balcony, firing wildly at his own hired guns. His hair was wild, his expensive clothes torn and stained. "You're all traitors," he screamed. "I made this town. I made all of you." "He's lost his mind," Doc Muller said, spurring his horse forward. "There might be wounded." A shot rang out, and the doctor's hat flew from his head. He quickly retreated back to the group. "So much for serving warrants peacefully," Caleb observed dryly. He turned to Wheeler. "Your call, Marshal." Wheeler's face was grim. "We contain this. Keep them from escaping, but let them burn themselves out if that's what they want. Mary Ann, Rachel, get back to that grove of cottonwoods. This is about to get ugly." "No," Mary Ann said firmly. "I'm staying. This ends today, one way or another." Before anyone could argue, Thomas Hargrove appeared in the doorway of the main house, dragging someone with him. Even at a distance, they could see the hostage was a young woman, one of the household maids. "Stay back," Thomas shouted, pressing a gun to the terrified girl's head. His bandaged hand made him clumsy, but his desperation made him dangerous. "Anyone comes closer, and she dies." "That's Lucia Mendoza," someone whispered. "She's only 16. Mary Ann felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This was who Thomas truly was, a coward who would hide behind an innocent girl. This was the man she'd almost married. "Let her go! Thomas!" she called out, spurring her horse forward despite the shouts of alarm from the others. "It's me you're angry at. Take me instead. Mary Ann." Thomas's voice cracked with emotion, rage, fear, perhaps even some twisted form of love. "You did this. You turned them all against us." "No, Thomas, you did this to yourself." She dismounted, walking slowly toward the burning house. Behind her, she heard Caleb cock his rifle, tracking Thomas's every move. "Let Lucia go, please. Whatever you thought we had, if you ever cared for me at all. Don't hurt an innocent girl." Thomas wavered, the gun shaking in his good hand. For a moment, she thought she saw the man he might have been. Young, frightened, trapped by his father's expectations and his own cruel nature. Then his face hardened. "You were supposed to be mine," he said, raising the gun toward Mary Ann. 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Thomas jerked, the gun flying from his hand. He looked down in shock at the spreading red stain on his chest, then crumpled to the ground. Lucia ran screaming toward the posse. Mary Ann turned to see Caleb lowering his rifle, smoke still wisping from the barrel. But he hadn't been the only one to fire. Her father held his old army Colt, and even Rachel had drawn her pistol. "Nobody threatens my daughter," Samuel Miller said grimly. The death of Thomas seemed to break something in William Hargrove. He appeared at an upper window, laughing maniacally as flames licked at the curtains behind him. "You think you've won?" he shouted. "I've sent word to every business contact, every politician I own. This town will be blacklisted. No trains will stop here. No cattle will be bought. You'll starve without us. We'll take that chance." Judge Harrison called back. "Surrender now. Hargrove, it's over." William's response was to throw a lit oil lamp into the yard, sending the hired guns scattering. The fire was spreading rapidly now, jumping from building to building with hungry intensity. "Fall back," Wheeler ordered. "Let it burn. Anyone who wants to surrender, throw down your weapons and walk out with your hands up." Over the next hour, men stumbled from the inferno. Some were hired guns who'd realized too late that their employer had gone mad. Others were ranch hands who'd been trapped in the crossfire. Doc Muller and Mary Ann worked frantically to treat burns and gunshot wounds, setting up a makeshift hospital in the Cottonwood Grove. William Hargrove never emerged, as the main house collapsed in a shower of sparks and timber. His mad laughter was finally silenced. The empire he'd built on fear and intimidation was reduced to ash and ember, scattered by the prairie wind. By noon, it was over. The Hargrove Ranch was a smoldering ruin, of the hired guns. 6 had died in the fighting, 4 were wounded, and the rest had surrendered. Thomas's body had been retrieved before the fires reached it, covered respectfully with a blanket despite everything he'd done. As the posse prepared to return to town with their prisoners, Caleb found Mary Ann standing apart from the others, staring at the devastation. "You all right?" he asked gently. "I don't know," she admitted. "I wanted them stopped, but not like this. Not with such waste, such death. Sometimes that's how tyranny ends," he said. "Not with justice, but with madness consuming itself. You gave them every chance to surrender peacefully. Did I? Or did my defiance that day push them over the edge?" Caleb turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Listen to me. You didn't make Thomas hit you. You didn't make William corrupt and cruel. All you did was refuse to be a victim. That's not a sin. That's courage." She looked up at him, seeing in his gray eyes an understanding born of hard experience. "What happens now? Now?" He gestured to the people around them, neighbors caring for wounded enemies, a town united in purpose. "Now you rebuild. Without the Hargroves' shadow, Dust Valley can become what it should have been all along." "And you?" she asked, fearing the answer. "Will you stay to see it?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the plains he'd wandered for so many years. "I've been drifting a long time, running from things I'd rather forget, but maybe it's time I stopped running. Dust Valley could use a man like you. I could use—" She stopped, blushing at her boldness. "Mary Ann," Rachel's voice interrupted. "We're heading back." The ride back to town was subdued despite their victory. The cost had been higher than anyone anticipated. But as they crested the final ridge and saw Dust Valley spread below them, something had changed. The town looked the same: weathered buildings, dusty streets, simple homes. But there was a lightness to it now, as if a storm had passed and left clear skies behind. People emerged from buildings as the posse returned, their faces showing relief and hope in equal measure. The prisoners were locked in the jail to await trial. The wounded were taken to Doc Muller's office, and slowly, life began to return to normal, or rather, to find a new normal. That evening, a town celebration was held in the church where it had all began. The blood-stained altar had been scrubbed clean, the scattered flowers replaced with fresh blooms. Reverend Whitmore led prayers for the dead, even for the Hargroves, though few mourned them sincerely. As the sun set, Mary Ann stood outside the church in her simple dress, not white, but a soft blue that matched the twilight sky. The bruises had faded, but the memory of that terrible morning remained. Yet she stood taller now, no longer the frightened bride, but a woman who'd found her voice and her strength. "Miss Miller." She turned to find Caleb approaching, cleaned up and wearing his best shirt. He'd shaved, revealing a strong jaw usually hidden by stubble. In his hand, he held his battered hat. "Mr. Cross," she smiled. "You clean up well for a drifter." "About that." He shifted, uncharacteristically nervous. "Marshal Wheeler's stepping down. Says he's too old for the job after all this excitement. The town council offered me the position." Her heart leaped. "And?" "I said I'd think about it. Depends on whether there's anything else keeping me here besides a steady job." She stepped closer, bold in a way the old Mary Ann never would have been. Might be there's a woman who owes you her life and would like to know you better. Might be she's hoping you'll stay." He smiled then, that rare, transformative expression that made him look years younger. "Might be I will." Inside the church, the fiddle started up again, playing a waltz this time. Without asking, Caleb offered his arm. She took it, and they walked back inside together, not for a wedding, but for something better, a new beginning. The stars came out over Dust Valley, shining down on a town reborn. The old order had fallen, consumed by its own corruption, but from the ashes, something stronger was rising, a community built on justice, courage, and the revolutionary idea that every person, regardless of wealth or status, deserved dignity and respect. And in the church where violence had shattered old chains, two people danced, a former drifter who'd found a reason to stay, and a woman who'd refused to be broken. Their story was just beginning, but already it was better than any ending either had dared to imagine. The prairie wind whispered through the town, carrying away the last smoke from the Hargrove Ranch and bringing with it the promise of tomorrow. Dust Valley had survived its trial by fire. Now it was time to build something new.